Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. We're back again in our journey through the entire Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And today we're launching off on a new chapter, Genesis chapter 39, where we're going to look at another episode in the life of Joseph. We're going to spend probably 3 days, 3 episodes looking at this chapter, and the overall theme I've given to this chapter is asking the question, what happens when we honor the Lord? And of course, that replies not just to Joseph in this time and in this place, but what happens today when believers decide they're going to honor the Lord? What would happen, might likely happen to you if you were going to decide you were going to honor the Lord in everything you did. So yes, we're back again in the story of Joseph, a young man who decides to honor the Lord in everything he does and in the way he lives his life, and we shall discover how that worked out for him. If you're new to this, there's always a transcript available, copyright free, for you to use in whatever way you want, credited or uncredited, for your own study or for the preparation of your own materials. Happy for you to do that in whatever way it serves you. And the place that you'll find the transcript of what I've said is in any audio version of the podcast within the episode notes, along with links to how you can connect with the ministry. But that's it by way of introduction today. I'll hopefully see you at the end, where I can just update you on a few other things. But now let's just dive in and join in at the beginning of today's new series of studies. See you at the end. Okay, here we are, friends. We're launching off today in a new chapter in the life of Joseph, in the story of Joseph, and this chapter is going to look at the goings on between Joseph and Potiphar and Potiphar's wife. So it's Genesis chapter 39, and I believe we're probably going to work our way through to this chapter. It'll probably take 3 episodes. So the question that I'm asking as we consider this chapter is, what happens when believers decide they're going to honor the Lord? In other words, when someone makes a decision to honor the Lord in everything they do. They don't just decide, I'm going to honor the Lord in my personal life. They say, you know what, I'm going to bring that service aspect of honoring the Lord into everything I do at work and at home and in my personal life as well. And the question really is, if you or I were to decide that that was going to be our priority in life, how might that work out for us? Would it prevent problems arising from us? Or would it in fact produce some new problems that might do those two things together, mightn't it? Would there be some unexpected consequences on our new outlook on life? I think there's an opinion round that when you make a decision to dedicate your life to the Lord, then all your problems will go away, and you won't, or at least you won't have as many problems as you used to have. Is that true? Or will indeed you will overcome some problems, but just find them replaced with new ones? So it's a question really worth considering, isn't it? What really happens when you make a decision to decide to follow the Lord? What will the consequences be when you decide to honor the Lord in everything that you do? Well, I think we can find some help and some answer to those questions here, because we have a sort of an example, a sort of almost like a test case with some answers to that question. And it's here in the Old Testament at the point we've arrived here today in this book of Genesis. So yes, we're back again in the life story of Joseph, which is going to take a great deal of the text up in these remaining chapters of this book. Because in it we have a young man who decided that he was going to honor the Lord in all of his life. I wonder if what happens to him can be an indication of what might happen to us if we were to do the same thing, or when we do the same thing. So I invite your attention today to the beginning of Genesis chapter 39, and let's examine this episode together, this episode in the life of Joseph over the next few days. And we'll begin to do that by reading verses 1 and 2 together. I'd remind you that as well as the transcript, the actual scripture verses are also within the episode notes section of any audio version of the podcast. Anyway, verse 1, chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, so he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Now, to really understand what's going on here, we need to pause and review the story a bit. Think about what's happened to Joseph up to this point. You'll recall prior to this, Joseph was a family man who grew up in Palestine. Well, when I say he was a family man, he was a member of a very large family. He had 11 brothers, but his brothers were jealous of him because he was clearly his father's favourite. He was the apple of his father's eye, the text tells us in the King James translation. And to make matters worse, he was also a dreamer who had a dream or two, but these dreams seemed to indicate that he believed that someday he would have authority over all the others, over not just his brothers, but his mother and father also. And that provoked those brothers to envy, jealousy, and that's putting it mildly. So the brothers got to a point where they actually initially planned to murder him, but they later concocted this idea that they could sell him into slavery and profit from it. So they literally sold their brother to some merchants who were traveling through their grazing area, and those merchants, the Ishmaelites, they took him to Egypt. So that's the backdrop of the story before we get to where Joseph is today at the opening of chapter 39. And verse 1 opened by saying, now Joseph have been taken down to Egypt by these people, and it goes on to draw attention to the fact that he's now been purchased by Potiphar. This man Potiphar is identified as a captain of the guard and as an Egyptian. So that's the background to the story. Joseph has been made a slave, and he's been bought by this character called Potiphar, an important high-ranking official in the Egyptian empire. But it also tells us straight away that the Lord was favourable to Joseph and that he was a successful young man, and because of that, the household of his master Potiphar also was successful. Now, what is going on here is interesting because we've just seen this statement, the Lord was with him and he was successful. But we need to think about what that means, because these two things are put together in the one sentence, which tells me the Lord was with him, yes, and that's why he was successful. He was honouring the Lord in his life, and the Lord was honouring him in his situation. And it will become evidence just how much he sticks to his principles and honours the Lord and continues to honour the Lord as we dig further and progress further into this chapter. As we dig deeper and progress further into this chapter, I should have said. But we'll get to that later. But it is interesting to note, isn't it, that right at the beginning, early in this chapter, it tells us that the Lord was with Joseph and he was successful. Part of the success was the house of his master in which he lived. He seems to have been promoted. It tells us he was in the house of his master, which says that he hasn't stayed for long in the servants' quarters. He had become so favoured by Potiphar that he was now actually a resident living in the main house. So the passage opens by telling us of the success of Joseph to the point where he's now been promoted out from among the slaves, and he now lives in the main house. The story continues. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord had given him success in everything he did, Joseph found favour in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything he owned. So please note that it tells us the master saw that the Lord was with him, And he knew that the reason that his household, Potiphar knew the reason that his household was having success was because the Lord was with Joseph. So Joseph, finding favor in the sight of the Lord, was now bringing a blessing to the house, and he had now been promoted and was living in the house of Potiphar as the overseer of that house. And all that Potiphar possessed, Joseph had been put in charge of. What an amazing responsibility. So this is the continuing success of Joseph being laid out before us as these early verses in chapter 39 progress. But please notice, and this is really important, the text says that the master saw that the Lord was with him. Now notice it doesn't just say that he saw that God was with him. This is important. It says he saw that the Lord was with him. Now, as I've said before, and I hope you're aware, that when you see the word Lord used in the Old Testament, the word Lord is referring to the covenant name of God, not to just the generic name of God that might have been bandied about by anybody at that time. This is sometimes, the use of the term Lord, sometimes it's actually translated as Yahweh, but by its use it means that we're recognizing that who is being referred to as the God who is bringing prosperity in this situation is the God of the nation of Israel, the personal name of God. So Potiphar didn't just notice that some kind of divine favor was falling his way. The text is telling us he specifically noticed that Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of Joseph, was the one who was blessing him. And you got to ask, well, that's important, but how in the world might Potiphar have known that? Well, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. It's not complicated. The answer is, obviously, Joseph must have told him. The Bible tells us in the Gospel of Matthew, let your works shine out so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. And that's certainly what is going on here. I believe that's a big part of what's going on here. But this isn't just saying do good works to impress people. It tells us we have to walk the walk and talk the talk as well. But let me ask you, if we're doing good works, how would someone know what you were doing was because of your love for your Father in heaven? Well, it's pretty obvious. There must have been an aspect to this in which he talked about it, in which he credited the Lord and told people that he was a child of Yahweh, the God Most High. And I believe absolutely that that's what's going on here. And I believe that that's absolutely what we must do. If we do good works in isolation, that's one thing. But people need to know that we do them to bring pleasure to God. We do them to honor the Lord. We credit the Lord God in our motivations as to what we're doing. And I believe that's what's happened here with Joseph. No doubt Potiphar saw he was honoring the Lord and he had a commitment to the Lord. And the text tells us that Potiphar, his master, saw it and recognized that that's why he and his household were being blessed. That's why he was successful. And when his master, Potiphar, saw that the Lord was with him, and he also came to know that it was his love for the Lord that motivated him to do all he did, Potiphar reached the point where he understood that it was because of the Lord God Most High, the Lord God of Israel, Yahweh, that was the reason that he was prospering also. Now you will have noticed I said in verse 3 that he was in the house, and now in verse 4 it says he was overseer. He has responsibility over the entire house. So Joseph has been drawn first out of the general slave population, put in a position of some responsibility in the house, and now he's reached the point where he's overseer of the entire household. So again, the Lord is honoring Joseph, and he's making him successful, and that is indicated by the fact that he's been promoted, well, at least twice now. There's a lesson, I think, for all of us here, And that is, if we are faithful in the little things, the Lord will see to it that we can be raised up in the big things. As a matter of fact, in Luke chapter 16, we are told in verse 10 that Jesus said, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own?" So Jesus is saying in that passage that if we are faithful to the little things in life, then we may very well get promoted to the big things. And Joseph here in Genesis chapter 39, I believe, is an illustration of that fact. Okay, back into verse, picking up in the text in Genesis 39, picking up at verse 5. From that time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned. The Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in his house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, with Joseph in charge, and he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So it's from this point that he's completely in charge of Potiphar's house, complete overseer of the house, and the Lord blesses the Egyptian's house. He blesses him in his house, and he blesses him in his fields. This means that obviously he's blessing the household with bumper crops, or expanding flocks and herds, so to speak. So you can say he's blessing him in his home life and in his business life. Now this is a principle that is established early in the book of Genesis, and I believe is taught throughout Scripture. It was initiated namely back in chapter 12 when it says the Lord said he was going to bless Abraham, and Abraham was going thereby to be a blessing to the whole world. So that's established a principle on which God operates. But note, he blesses us, yes he does, but he blesses us in order that we can bless others. And that's clearly what's happening here. So when we are blessed, make sure that we use that blessing to bless others as well. And because of that's the situation here, Potiphar is being blessed to such a point that he has the confidence to leave everything in Joseph's care. Joseph does not have to worry about anything except the food he eats, it says. Please note, Potiphar so trusted Joseph that Joseph took care of anything, that Potiphar just went about his everyday and his other businesses, and he didn't worry anymore about that aspect of his home life or his business life at home. So that's where we're up to. So I wonder if it's all going to remain plain sailing for Joseph. Nothing but blessing after blessing. Well, the story continues. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took a notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." It's an interesting phrase used here about Joseph, who he described as well built and handsome. There's something interesting about this statement. Well, obviously, firstly, it's just telling us that he inherited his good looks, and that would seem, the Bible would seem to suggest that probably came from his mother Rachel, because she was mentioned in the same way. As a matter of fact, just as an aside, there are only two other men in the Bible of whom it was said they were handsome. One is David and the other was Absalom. But what really intrigues me about this is in the book of Genesis, when it talks about people being physically beautiful, other than Joseph, it is only women that are mentioned in this context and in this way. In fact, the word used here that is translated for handsome in our modern translation is normally translated elsewhere in Genesis as beautiful. And that word, handsome, it is in fact beautiful, is used several times about Joseph. So I feel we need to just pause and take a minute and do a quick survey of the use of this word. In Genesis chapter 12, it tells us this: And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarah his wife, Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Now, in this situ, Abraham wanted to lie about her because she was indeed so beautiful. He was worried, and he said, pretend you're my sister, for fear that someone will be so impressed that when they're in this strange land that they might kill him rather, and take her away. But the point I want to make is the scripture is telling us that she was a quote unquote beautiful woman. And the same thing is said of Rebecca in Genesis chapter 6, where it says, And the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, She is my sister, for he was afraid to say, She is my wife, because he thought, lest the men of this place kill me for Rebecca, because she is beautiful to behold. So Isaac does exactly the same thing as his father did, and he says his wife's his sister, for fear, because he's afraid that if they know that she's his wife, then the local men might just kill him and take her as their own. And the reason they might do this is because she is described as beautiful. Now, there's one more example in Genesis of someone being described as beautiful, but we're going to look at the consequences. We're going to look at that and the consequences of these people being beautiful, both Joseph and this other person. But we'll do that next time in the next episode. Okay, folks, we're back again. We're in part 2 of what I believe will be 3 days in Genesis chapter 39, looking at the story of Joseph and Potiphar, and particularly at what goes on between Joseph and Potiphar's wife today. So in that part of Genesis, where rather usually, you remember last time, we'd seen Joseph described as beautiful, and we've been thinking about how that Hebrew term used here in the Bible had only previously been applied to women. And we've already looked at 2 examples of people who were described as beautiful: Abraham's wife Sarah in Genesis chapter 12, and Rebecca, Isaac's wife, in Genesis chapter 26, both of whom are described in this way using the same word that is used of Joseph here. But then again in Genesis chapter 29, verse 17, we're also told of someone else who is beautiful in this way. In verse 17 it says, Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. So all of these women so far in the book of Genesis, 3 generations of them, have been described as being physically beautiful. And the text goes at length not only to point that out, but to talk about it. These are 3 generations of gorgeous women in Joseph's family line. So I suppose it's not surprising really that they have a son who is also described, well, in our translation he's described as handsome, but the same term is used as of the women who are described as beautiful. And we're also given the added detail that he's well built as well as good looking. So he's obviously a guy who's clearly handsome and kept himself in good shape. Now, I'm probably showing my age a bit here, but in my day, when I was a boy growing up, Charles Atlas was the body that every boy wanted to remember. The adverts for his Keep Fit system and some of the Keep Fit devices he sold was in the back pages of every comic book or magazine that a boy might be interested in. But like I say, I'm probably just showing my age now. But at any rate, the text here, back in Genesis chapter 39, is telling us that Joseph was not only a good man, but a good-looking man, but that he had a good physique as well. Now, this is important in the story of Genesis 39, because maybe it goes to explain a little bit of what happens next. So let's pick up the text at verse 7, where it tells us, And it came to pass, after these things, that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused. And he said to his master's wife, Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand, meaning his care. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do such wickedness and sin against God? So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day that he did not heed her, to lie with her or to be with her. So this first part of the message, the first 6 verses of this chapter, were telling us simply that Joseph loved and he served the Lord, and because of that the Lord honoured Joseph, and also because of that Joseph was successful not only for himself in the positions that he held, but because he had honoured the Lord blessed the house of Potiphar as well. So he honoured the Lord, and the Lord honoured him, and he was being promoted, and he's been put in charge of the whole household by this point. But now, beginning in verse 7, there's a sinister turn of events. He is trusted in the first 6 verses. He is trusted by Potiphar, but now he is about to be tested. In verses 7 to 12, he is going to be tempted by Potiphar's wife, and this is the second phase of the story. And this is the beginnings of the forces of injustice starting to rise up against him, which will eventually lead to him facing the most grossest of injustices. But the text in this section simply told us that Potiphar's wife longed after him. But the King James translation is being quite polite, and so are many of the modern translation, because the word that's used here more accurately is described in some of the modern translation as she is lusting after him. Now, we often think or talk about men lusting after women, and of course that's true, and that happens a lot. But I think it doesn't get as much press. It certainly didn't used to get as much press until recently, that sometimes women as well lust after men, and that's definitely what's going on here. This woman, Potiphar's wife, is doing nothing less than looking upon Joseph and lusting after him physically, but he refuses her. And what's significant about this, friends, is that it says in the text that she spoke to him day by day, so she's persistent in her attempts to try and seduce him. In other words, this was not just a one-off single event. For Joseph, this is happening over and over again, repeatedly, as she constantly tries to refuse to seduce him. And despite of that pressure, he repeatedly refuses her. And in fact, he refuses her to such an extent that he avoids her. He won't even go near the bedroom when she's there. He doesn't even want to be seen or be alone in her company. So he not only refuses the sexual advances, but he tries to avoid her completely. Now, I'd say that that's an insightful observation, and it's noticeable that it points that out, because the Bible will tell us elsewhere, like in the book of Romans, that we are to put on the Lord Jesus Christ and to make no provision for the flesh, make no provision to fulfill its lust. So if there is temptation in our lives, or there is a test in our lives, the best thing we can do is to do everything within our power to avoid ourselves being exposed to that particular moral risk. And for some of us, it may be a particular moral risk that we are uniquely vulnerable to. Now, that would tell me that if you have a problem with drinking, for example, then clearly you shouldn't go to bars. And if you have a problem with drugs, then maybe definitely you shouldn't hang out with drug users. You should try and change your social circle. And if you have a problem with lust, friends, well, simply change the filters on your internet settings. So Joseph was avoiding the very opportunities that were being presented to him. He wouldn't even put himself in a position, or he tried not to find himself in a position where he would be alone with her. But let's see what happens next. Verse 11. But it happened about this time, when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand, and fled and ran outside. So she hinds him, and she persists until one day she actually physically grabs hold of him by his coat or his overgarment, and she tries to physically draw him into bed with her. But Joseph was so committed to honoring the Lord in this area of his life that he fled, and he literally flees, leaving the coat behind in her hand. That's very interesting, because also in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians 6 verse 18, the Bible actually says, flee sexual immorality, flee immorality of all sorts. So Romans tells us not to make provision to fulfill the lust of the flesh, and 1 Corinthians 6 says the same thing when it tells us to actually flee from those things, to flee from those temptations. Matter of fact, you'll probably remember I quoted quite recently 3 or 4 studies back where it says there is no thing common to man that God will not make a way of escape so that you may be able to bear it. What's the way of escape on this occasion? And often, on many occasions, it is just simply to flee from the temptation or the test that presents itself to you. And in this case, that's exactly what Joseph does. He flees. So friends, you too, when faced temptation or a test, don't hang around. Leave, flee. Don't stay. Don't put yourself or make provision for the flesh. Just go. So again, what we have here is Joseph honouring the Lord as best he can. But does this prevent the problems that he has? Will this mean that everything will be okay? Well, the answer, sadly for him, is no. The Lord was with him. The Lord blessed him. He was promoted again and again. But clearly the Lord did not solve all the problems that he would face. But by Joseph simply refusing, there's no debating it, he refused to be with her to the point where he flee. So he, in one level, he was successful in resisting the temptation. But like always, in a situation where there is some degree of success in resisting temptation, it will always depend more on the character of the person than on the circumstances. And the character depends on how it is developed, and it can only be developed by commitment to the will of God. We can see Joseph's character, it's been developed, and we can see how it's been developed. We can see how it's been developed in his loyalty concerning what his master owns and how he's built up trust, and think more and more things have been entrusted to his care. We can also see it in the responsibility of what God has given him responsibility for, things that belong to something else. And it's further obvious in his responsibility with God, respecting his special personal calling. And additionally, later on, friends, we'll see this responsibility growing in God's concerning Joseph's sacred vocation as a member of and a protector of the whole house of Israel. But what this story tells us is just because you've decided to honor the Lord, and that may mean that your character is being developed, it may mean that you're being blessed by God in more and more areas of your life, it will not get rid of all potential problems that you might have to face in the future. Joseph honored the Lord, and yet he encountered this enormous temptation. And even though he responds correctly, it doesn't necessarily mean that things will work out for him. If we honor the Lord, the truth is we will be tested and will temptation, it will still be there. But what then happens to Joseph is he refuses the temptation, and he refuses to make provision for the press, to make provision for the flesh. So I wonder how it's going to work out for him. Now remember, he's honoured the Lord, and the Lord has honoured him up to this point. He's made him successful, and he's blessed him, and he's blessed other people through him. But this hasn't presented this huge problem like this rising up. As a matter of fact, in the next phase of this chapter, Joseph is going to be tested even more by the reactions of those around him to this incident. He had been trusted by Potiphar up to this point, but he's been tested, he's been tempted by Potiphar's wife, and now he's about to enter an area of great testing as he faces a gross injustice. Well, just how bad this can get? Well, let's look at verse 13, which tells us, "And so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, then she called to the men of the house and spoke to them, saying, See, he has brought us a Hebrew in to mock us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept the garment with her until her master, her husband, came home." There's a famous proverb that says that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And Joseph here, he's refused Potiphar's wife's sexual advances, and now as a scorned woman, she cries rape. She calls everybody in and says, "Look, this man has tried to rape me. It's only because I screamed that he fled, leaving his garment in my hand." Did you then notice what she said next? She said, "He brought into us a Hebrew to mock us." Now, what in the world is she saying? Who is she talking about when she says he? Who's the one who brought him in? Who brought Joseph into the house? Well, of course, the answer is Potiphar. She's blaming her husband, and she's saying it's really his fault that this has happened. He's the one that brought this Hebrew lad, Joseph, into the house, and he's done so by disrespecting and mocking us. No wonder Potiphar is going to feel guilty and will want to react in a certain way. Well, we'll find out how he reacts in the next verses. "So she kept his garment with her until her master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, saying, The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me. So it happened, as I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled outside. So it was, when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, Your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused." So she keeps the garment. She keeps Joseph's garment to show her husband. And verse 19 tells us, when Potiphar heard what she said, and he hears his wife blaming him for bringing the young man into the household, well, he, of course, gets very angry. Not surprisingly, of course, he would be very angry because he gets home and he hears that this man that he's entrusted with everything he has, he's given him authority and oversight, and in fact a role to care for all he has. He's betrayed him by attacking his wife. He was angry, very, very angry, I'm quite sure. Where we're going to find out what the repercussions of that anger are for Joseph in the next episode. So we're picking up again in the closing section, the last few verses of this chapter 20. This is the third of 3 days that we've spent in Genesis chapter 39. And if you remember, this is the point where, well, poor Joseph has just been thrown in jail. I'll just read to you verse 20 of chapter 39, where it says, Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. So that's a bit of a bad result for Joseph, isn't it? He's managed through this difficult time, this challenging time, to keep hold of his morals. He hasn't succumbed. He hasn't slept with Potiphar's wife. He's honoured the Lord continually, yet he still has ended up in prison. Matter of fact, it actually says he's ended up in the king's prison. So what Bible experts tell me is that this means he hasn't just gone to any ordinary prison. He was probably in a prison that was reserved for particularly difficult people or for political prisoners. And also those same Bible experts would say that this prison would apparently have been worse and have a stricter regime than if he'd just been put into an ordinary prison. Now, as a matter of fact, his experience of what happens to him is mentioned later on in the Bible in Psalm 105, when David writes about that, and he says, He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave, and they hurt his feet with fetters. He was laid in irons until the time that the word came to pass, and the word of the Lord tested him. So Psalm 105 fills a few of the gaps for us, doesn't it, and tells us a little bit about what's been happening here, namely that he was under a harsh regime and he was being particularly tested through this time. Anyway, back to Genesis 39 and verse 21, where it tells us, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." So even in prison, the Lord is with Joseph, and the Lord is continuing to show him mercy and give him favor in the sight, this time, of the keeper of the prison. So here we go again. Joseph is still staying true to his word. He's honoring the Lord in the way he lives, and the Lord continues to bless him. So even though he's got thrown in prison, still the blessings of God are being poured into his life. And through this time, even in this place, Joseph is able to find favor. And he does that by finding mercy in the sight of the warden of the jail, the person who's in charge of the prison, the keeper of the prison, as it's described in some of the translations. So I'll just read the last two verses that close off this chapter, because there it tells us, "And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper." So again, even as a prisoner in prison, he's getting promoted. In fact, it implies to me he's probably been promoted several times during his time in prison. It happened to him, of course, in the home of Potiphar, and now he gets thrown into prison, and he's getting promoted again. And he gets to have an authority over all the other prisoners. Now, again, the interesting phrase in verse 21 is it says, "But the Lord was with him, and the keeper of the prison, the head warder of the prison," verse 23, "did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority." So again, he's managed to win the total trust of the people who have power over him. Why? Well, again, because the Lord has been with him, and he's remained obedient to the Lord and honourable in everything that he's done, and because of that, he again is prospering, and those people around him are prospering. So what we have here in very simple terms is the Lord being with Joseph, and Joseph staying true to his obligations to honour the Lord in every way, particularly in the way he lives his life and in relation to other people. And because of that, the Lord still is able to continue to bless him, even whilst he's in prison. Now, if you remember when we opened up this chapter 3 days ago, the study of chapter 39 of Genesis, I began by asking, what do you think is likely to happen in your life if you live a life that truly honours the Lord? Well, the answer to that, this passage is telling me, is that the Lord will bless us. Now, and the Lord will honour us back, but that doesn't mean that we'll escape trouble, because that's not what we're seeing here, is it? It doesn't mean that all our problems will be solved just because we're living an honourable life before the Lord. Or it doesn't mean even because the Lord is blessing you, that you mightn't have problems, or any problems that you have will be solved and go away. In fact, it's entirely possible for the blessings of God to be poured out into your life while at the same time you are going through very hard times. In fact, these two things often go together. They often go hand in hand at the same time. So let's try and pull this all together and think about what this chapter is really telling us. I believe at its most straightforward level, chapter 39 is simply reminding us that because Joseph honoured the Lord, that no matter what circumstances he was in, even when he was in prison, as a result of his faithfulness and his desire to live an honourable life before the Lord, that the Lord continued to find ways to bless him. And one of the great lessons for us, I believe, is if we do the same, then the Lord will honour and bless us.
But friends, that doesn't mean there won't be trouble in our lives. So before I close, I'd like to make a couple of obligations, and one again is perhaps familiar to you now. You maybe feel I'm a bit of a broken record with my teaching styles, but what I feel is very important to do is put this story within the context of the book it is written in. We tend to read or we tend to study these Bible stories in isolation. That's bound to happen by nature, because you don't tend to sit down and study a whole book at once. It would take you 2 hours to read the book of Genesis in its own right. But we tend to break it into sections and look at each story in isolation. But we should always remember that each and every story within the Bible lies within the context of the book that is written in, and sometimes within an even wider context than that. One commentator I read said this about this story, particular part of the story of Joseph, and I quote, "This story about Joseph reverses a well-known plot in the patriarchal narrative. Whereas before it was the beautiful wife of the patriarch who was sought by foreign rulers, now it was Joseph, the handsome patriarch, who himself was sought by the wife of the foreign ruler." That's from Dr. Thomas Constable. It's an expository wrote from 1970. So, in other words, whereas in the earlier narrative it was either the Lord or sometimes even the moral or ethical position of a foreign ruler that stepped in and rescued the wife. Do you remember those stories earlier with Sarah and with Rebecca, where they were disguised and hidden as the wives of Abraham and Isaac? It was in those cases, it was the foreign leader who in a sense was the one who was responsible for rescuing their wives rather than the patriarch himself. But here we see it's Joseph, by his own moral courage, that in fact saves the day, not only for him but for those around him. In the preceding narratives in the book of Genesis, the focus of the writer has been on God's faithfulness in fulfilling his covenant promises, in spite of the machinations of some of the early patriarchs. But in the story of Joseph, the writer's attention is turned to the human response of Joseph to he himself being tested. And these events, I believe, are intended, as they're described, they're intended to give a balance and a counterbalance to the narratives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that has preceded them. Together, the two sections show both God's faithfulness in spite of human failure, as well as the necessity also for us to always show obedience and a faithful response, no matter what the circumstances we're having to face. So yes, I do believe it's critical to see the story in the light of the whole book, particularly because it stands in a tremendous contrast to the previous similar stories whereby we saw the patriarch fall down. They were stories of moral failure, but here God has seemed to bless Joseph and bring his will to pass and pour blessings into the life of Joseph because of his moral standing. When understood together, both of these sides of the same coin, if you like, they show God's faithfulness on one side in spite of human failure, and on another side as well as and because of Joseph's obedient and faithful response. But now let's look at the story in its own right. Each scene in the record of Joseph's life stands there to reveal some distinctive trait of character about this very special young man. But usually these character traits, these moral fortitudes, these moral strengths usually come out of a situation where he faced a personal crisis, sometimes a personal moral crisis. Joseph experiences God's blessing as he served faithfully in Potiphar's house, even when his master's wife repeatedly tried to seduce him. He refused her offer because he did not want to sin against God and he did not want to betray Potiphar's trust. So his moral character matured and strengthened through the difficulty and the temptations and the testings that he faced. Joseph continued to enjoy God's blessing even when he was wrongly imprisoned, even when he was thrown in prison because of the false charges that she made against him. So that's the story of Joseph. He's revealed as a man of great character, someone who has proven personal integrity throughout the stories and the little glimpses of his life that we see through these individual story chapters. And we will see him to develop into a prototype type of Christ as his character develops. He is a person who is living a life of personal integrity, and that helps promote his spiritual maturity. And we should learn from that and recognize that such times and such troubles, if we take victory over them, they prepare us and they make us more fully able to recognize and receive God's blessing in our own lives. The best things in life are never the easiest things to obtain. The best things in life are always the hardest things to obtain, the things that we have to work for the most, the things that we have to strive for, the things that we have to be brave and face those dragons and those temptations and overcome them. This is a particularly pertinent message, I believe, for young men, because young men are needed in the church and young men are needed to be brave and show fortitude, just like Joseph did. Just to think how graciously Joseph handled himself here amongst all these trials and hardships. Many of us would have crumbled and become bitter, I would imagine. But instead, his spirit does not become downhearted. He develops strength, fortitude. He keeps trusting in the Lord, and he becomes a better person because of it. He consistently refuses to be unfaithful to the principles and the moral ordinances that the Lord has given him. And he sticks to that, whatever the situation, and importantly, whatever the potential negative consequences that he might face because of it or might arise out of it. So what we've learned in this chapter, friends, is that Joseph honoured the Lord, and as a result, the Lord honoured him. And that's what we should do too. Now, that doesn't mean that he or we today won't have difficulties. It doesn't mean we won't face temptations. It just means that if we stick at it, if we stick to the journey, and we stick living in a way that honours the Lord, then the Lord will bless us. The whole story of this chapter comes down to the principle that is stated for us in the very final verse. Genesis chapter 39 closes out its text with verse 33, which says, "Because the Lord was with him, whatever he did, the Lord makes it prosper." Have you noticed that statement is made in the opening chapter and the opening verse, and in the last verse of this chapter? So that's the issue. It isn't that we honour the Lord and the Lord blesses us. It's that no matter what happens, we honour the Lord and the Lord will bless us. And that is what's significant for us about this story. So we need to honour the Lord in everything we do. And we need to do it with an expectation that it doesn't mean that our problems and our challenges will go away, but we can have the expectation that no matter what happens, the Lord will be with us. Here's the key. This is what I want you to take away from this passage. Carry it in your heart every day, or even write it down and put it in your pocket. The Lord was with him. Now, there was a very famous, the opposite of this. There was a very unfamous, a relatively unknown civil servant in America in the 1920s called Charles Evan Hughes. He served as a translator under two American presidents. Under President Harding, Gilbert Harding I think it was, and then under Coleridge. Now, he was called to attend a conference, a post-World War I conference, and he was taken there as President Calvin Coolidge's assistant to run the team of interpreters that were with him. And he was responsible for creating the framework on which the interpreters would work. And he was given, he told the interpreters that they were to give him a general summarized translation of whatever was spoken, particularly in the languages of German, Portuguese, and Spanish at that time. Not quite sure why those three languages, but that's what he felt were the key people there. Now, he emphasized something, and he said, while a summary translation is ample for our general purposes, I want to make sure that you catch and write down every word in the couple of sentences that follow on after the speaker says but. Because he went on to explain what always follows but is almost the most important part. Now, that was true of those speeches in 1920, heard long ago, but it's also true in this passage, and it's true in our lives. If we honor the Lord will honor us. That's what it says. But no matter what happens, the Lord will still be with us.